This is not a story of love found in the thunder of a chase, but in the hushed quiet of a cabin door latching against the dark. It is about the way a man's hands, calloused from an axe handle, can learn the gentle weight of a sleeping child. It is a promise that the most unbreakable shield is not forged in a fire, but built in the space between two hearts, with the silent vows of shared watch and steadfast care. Silas Blackwood knew the mountain. He knew the language of its seasons, the moods of its creeks, the silence of its deep woods. His cabin, a single room built of sturdy pine and unwavering solitude, was an extension of himself, weathered, quiet, and self-sufficient. His days were a litany of deliberate routines. He woke before the sun. The single tin cup and plate were washed and put away. The wood was chopped. The traps were checked. Loneliness was not an intruder. It was the bedrock of his existence, a familiar quiet he had cultivated since the world below had taken everything from him. He had made his peace with it, or so he told himself. But some nights the fire would burn low, and the silence in the cabin would grow teeth. It spoke of the empty chair, the cold side of the cot, the profound and aching absence of another heartbeat in the dark. He would stand at the window, his own reflection, a ghostly stranger in the glass, a yearning for a life he'd lost, tightening his chest like a vice. He had built his life to need no one, a fortress of solitude. He never imagined someone would come seeking sanctuary in it. She appeared at dusk, a wraith emerging from the trees, her face pale with exhaustion, her clothes torn. But it wasn't her that stopped his heart. It was the small, bundled infant clutched to her chest. She stumbled into the clearing, her eyes wild with the hunted fear he recognized from the war. He moved from his porch, his hand not on his rifle, but held out, palm open. She flinched, but didn't run. She was spent. Her gaze darted from his face to the dark woods behind her, and then back again. He saw the fierce, desperate love of a mother protecting her young, and it cracked open a part of his soul he thought had long since turned to stone. She took one more staggering step, and her strength gave out. He caught her, his arms easily taking her slight weight. Her eyes fluttered open, locking on his. "Please," she whispered, the word a ragged breath of pure terror. Her hand tightened on the infant. "Don't let them take my baby." The words were not a plea. They were a transfer of a sacred trust. In that moment, the walls of his fortress crumbled. He, a man who had sworn off the world, was suddenly and irrevocably bound to these two strangers. He lifted her into his arms. The sleeping infant nestled between them, and carried them across the threshold of his solitary life. The latch of the door clicking shut behind them was a sound that echoed not with closure, but with a terrifying, profound beginning. The quiet of his home had been broken, not by a sound, but by a whispered promise he knew he would die to keep. Elara woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing chicory. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was low, made of rough-hewn logs. She was lying on a narrow cot, tucked under a heavy wool blanket that smelled of pine and clean earth. Then memory crashed back in. The desperate flight, the looming forest, the mountain man's face. Panic seized her, and her hand flew to her side. The space was empty. A cry, sharp and helpless, tore from her throat. "Rowan!" Immediately, a large shadow fell over her. The man was there, his expression unreadable, but his movements were not threatening. He held up a hand, a gesture for calm. "He's safe." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting in a deep riverbed. "He's warm." He stepped aside, and she saw him. Her son, Rowan, was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle, a sturdy wooden crate lined with what looked like a clean, warm shirt, placed close to the stone hearth. The fire was banked, casting a steady, gentle heat. Relief washed over Elara so powerfully it left her weak. She pushed herself up, wincing at the ache in her muscles. The man watched her, his stance careful, giving her space. He was a mountain of a man, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could split a log in two, yet he had handled her child with a tenderness that defied his appearance. He gestured to a steaming mug on the small table beside the cot. "Drink. It'll help." She looked from the mug to his face. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, like a cloudy sky, and they held a deep, settled quiet. There was no guile in them. She was a survivor, and her survival depended on her ability to read people. This man was not a predator. He was something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. The cabin was small, impeccably clean, and brutally solitary. One cot, one chair, one set of utensils. The crushing weight of his loneliness was a tangible presence, and it soothed a fraction of her fear. A man this steeped in solitude was not a man of casual cruelty. He turned away, giving her a measure of privacy, and busied himself at the fire. "My name is Silas," he said to the flames. "Elara," she replied, her voice gaining a little strength. "My son is Rowan." Silas nodded, acknowledging the names. He did not ask what she was running from. He did not ask who was hunting her. He had accepted the trust she had placed in him with her whispered plea, and for now, that was enough. The practicalities of their situation were stark. One room, one bed, a woman and a baby who had appeared from nowhere. That first day, they moved around each other with a wary, deliberate courtesy. He showed her the water pump and the outhouse. He brought in a fresh pile of wood and quietly informed her, "The fire will need to be fed through the night." To keep him warm. He was already thinking of Rowan's needs. Elara, in turn, found a quiet purpose. While Rowan slept, she took the worn shirt from the crate and found a small tear in the seam. She had a needle and thread in her small satchel, and with practiced, efficient stitches, she mended it. It was a small act, but it was an offering, a way of saying, "I am not a helpless burden." When Silas came back inside, he saw the mended shirt. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered on the neat stitches for a long moment. A silent conversation had begun, spoken not in words, but in acts of care and quiet competence. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, a woman's quiet movements, and the steady, watchful presence of a man who had become their unlikely guardian. The days settled into a strange, new domesticity. The cabin, once a bastion of solitude, now hummed with the quiet rhythms of a shared life. Silas found his orderly routines completely upended, yet he did not resent it. He had spent years with only his own needs to consider. Now his every action was shaped by the presence of Elara and Rowan. He found himself chopping more wood than usual, ensuring there was always enough for the extra hot water needed to wash the baby's linens. He would return to the cabin to find the air filled with the scent of a simple stew simmering over the fire, a second bowl and spoon already set on the table beside his own. They spoke little, but a language of gestures was growing between them. When he noticed Elara shivering as she rocked Rowan near the drafty window, he spent an afternoon stuffing the cracks with dried moss and mud. The next morning, he found a neatly folded stack of his mended shirts on the foot of his pallet, each button reinforced, each frayed cuff stitched with a precision that spoke of painstaking care. Trust was being built in these small, quiet acts. Elara watched Silas, her initial fear slowly giving way to a cautious respect. She saw the way he moved around the infant, his large frame almost comically careful, as if afraid he might break something so small. He never presumed to touch Rowan, but his gaze would often linger on the boy's sleeping face, a flicker of some deep, unreadable emotion in his gray eyes. One afternoon, while Elara was washing clothes by the creek, Rowan began to fuss in his cradle. Silas, who had been sharpening an axe head on the porch, hesitated. He was frozen by a sense of helpless inadequacy. But the fussing escalated into a full-blown cry. Steeling himself, he went inside. He stood over the cradle, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "Hush now, little one," he rumbled, his voice startlingly deep in the small space. The baby, of course, did not hush. Silas looked around, his eyes landing on a small block of pine he'd been meaning to burn. On impulse, he picked it up and with his knife began to whittle. He worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced. He rounded the sharp edges, smoothed the surface, carving a simple, abstract shape, something small enough for a tiny hand to grasp. He placed the smooth piece of wood into the cradle, just beside Rowan's flailing fist. The baby's cries subsided into whimpers, his tiny fingers uncurling to brush against the new object. When Elara returned, she found the cabin quiet. She saw Silas at the table, his back to her, but her eyes went immediately to the cradle. She saw the small, carved toy clutched in Rowan's hand. Her heart gave a painful, unfamiliar lurch. She walked over to Silas, her footsteps soft on the floorboards. He looked up as she approached. He was crying, he said, his tone almost apologetic, as if he had overstepped a boundary. Elara said nothing. Instead, she reached out and gently brushed a wood shaving from his coarse sleeve. The touch was featherlight, barely there at all, but it was the first time she had initiated contact. It was a silent thank you, an acknowledgement of his kindness. A fragile bridge of trust had been built, connecting them across the quiet expanse of the room. Guardedness was giving way to a tentative, yearning curiosity about the stoic man who had offered them his protection without asking for anything in return. The autumn nights grew colder, a sharp chill seeping through the log walls of the cabin. The fire, which had once been a source of simple warmth for one, was now a vital lifeline for three. Silas found his sleep broken, his senses attuned to the slightest change in the room. He would wake in the deep dark to add another log to the hearth, his primary thought to keep the cold from reaching Rowan's cradle. He was perpetually weary, the hard labor of the day compounded by the vigilance of the night. Elara was exhausted too. The constant demands of a newborn, coupled with the lingering fear of her pursuers, had worn her down to a raw nerve. She would wake to nurse Rowan, her body aching with a bone-deep fatigue. She saw the dark circles under Silas's eyes, the way his broad shoulders slumped ever so slightly. He slept on a thin pallet on the floor, in the coldest part of the room, insisting she and Rowan have the cot and the warmth of the fire. The imbalance of it gnawed at her. He had given them everything, the safety of his home, his food, his tireless protection, and in return he was sacrificing his own rest. This stoic, honorable man was slowly running himself into the ground for them, and her pride could not allow it to continue. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would never complain, ever ask for a change in the arrangement. He would simply endure until he collapsed. The choice, she realized, had to be hers. One night, a fierce wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane. Rowan was restless, his small whimpers cutting through the sound of the storm. Elara, having just rocked him back to sleep, looked over at Silas. He was sitting up on his pallet, his back against the cold wall, a blanket wrapped around him. He hadn't even tried to lie down. He was simply standing watch. She could not bear it any longer. "Silas," she said, her voice a soft command in the dim light. He looked over, his expression one of quiet inquiry. "You cannot go on like this," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You need to sleep." "I'm fine," he rumbled, the automatic denial of a man unused to having his well-being considered. "You are not," she countered, her voice firm. She took a breath, steeling herself. This was not an invitation born of desire, but of a desperate, practical need for partnership. It was an act of profound trust. "There is a space here," she said, indicating the floor beside the cot in the protected circle of the hearth's warmth. "Bring your pallet here." We can share the watch. One of us can rest while the other listens for him. She had laid out the terms with careful, precise words. This was about shared duty, about survival. There could be no misunderstanding. He stared at her, the firelight catching the surprise and something more vulnerable in his eyes. He understood the magnitude of what she was offering. She was inviting him into their small, fragile circle. She was trusting him not just with their safety, but with her proximity. He rose from the cold corner of the room, dragging the thin mattress and blanket with him. He did not place it right beside the cot, but a respectful foot or so away, a clear acknowledgment of the boundary she had drawn. He lay down, the warmth from the fire a welcome relief. "Thank you, Elara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Lying there in the warm, firelit darkness, with the sound of the storm outside and the soft breathing of her child nearby, a new sense of security settled over Elara. They were no longer just a guardian and his charges. They were partners in a silent, watchful truce, a shared warmth, a shared duty. It was a mutual, consensual choice to close the distance, and in the quiet heart of the storm, it felt like the most honest vow she had ever known. The first frost coated the ground in a delicate lacework of silver, a beautiful but stark reminder that their supplies were dwindling. A trip to the nearest settlement, a dusty, hard-scrabbled town called Redemption, was unavoidable. The thought of leaving the sanctuary of the mountain filled Elara with a cold dread. But they needed flour, salt, and warmer clothes for Rowan. The tension on the journey down the mountain was a palpable thing. Silas sat tall on the wagon seat, his rifle resting across his lap, his gaze constantly scanning the trees. Elara sat beside him, Rowan bundled securely in her arms, her own senses on high alert. In the cabin, they had become a unit. Here, in the open, she was reminded of how vulnerable they were. The town, when they reached it, was even worse than she had feared. Eyes followed them as they moved down the main street. A lone mountain man with a woman and a baby was a curiosity, a story waiting to be told. She saw the whispers, the speculative glances from women on the boardwalk, the hard stares from men loafing outside the saloon. Silas seemed oblivious, his focus absolute, but she could feel the protective tension radiating from him. He kept the wagon moving at a steady pace, his presence a silent, formidable shield. "We'll go to the mercantile first," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dried goods. While Silas bartered for their supplies, Elara moved to the back of the store, looking for flannel for new swaddling clothes. It was then that she saw him. He was standing by the counter, talking to the proprietor, a tall, impeccably dressed man with silver hair and a cold patrician face. Judge Silas Blackwood, her son's grandfather. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He hadn't seen her yet. She tried to shrink back, to become invisible, but it was too late. His gaze swept the room and locked onto her. His eyes, a chillingly familiar shade of dark blue, widened first in shock and then narrowed with a possessive, predatory gleam. He ignored Silas completely and strode toward her. "So, this is where you've been hiding," he said, his voice a low, cultured snarl. He looked down at the bundle in her arms, his expression one of distaste. "Give me the child." Elara instinctively clutched Rowan tighter, taking a step back. "He is my son. You have no right." "I have every right," the judge countered, his voice rising. "He is a Blackwood. He will not be raised in squalor by a girl like you." The commotion had drawn Silas's attention. He moved from the counter to stand between them in two silent, purposeful strides. He did not touch the judge. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable wall. "The lady said no," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. The judge finally acknowledged him, his eyes sweeping over Silas's worn buckskins with contempt. "And who are you? Her backwoods protector?" "I am," Silas said, his gray eyes as cold and hard as granite. The confrontation was brief, a silent battle of wills fought over the head of the store's nervous owner. The judge, a man accustomed to getting his way through power and intimidation, seemed momentarily thrown by Silas's implacable calm. "This is a legal matter," the judge hissed, regaining his composure. "I will have my grandson. I will see the law on my side." He gave Elara one last, venomous look. "You will not keep him from me." With that, he turned and swept out of the store, leaving a vortex of fear and menace in his wake. The threat was no longer a shadowy possibility. It had a name and a face, and it was coming for them. The ride back up the mountain was cloaked in a heavy, anxious silence. The confrontation in town had shattered the fragile peace of their sanctuary. Judge Blackwood's threat echoed in the space between them, a promise of a battle that was no longer a matter of if, but when. Back in the relative safety of the cabin, the tension was unbearable. Silas built up the fire, his movements economical and grim. Elara checked on Rowan, who had mercifully slept through the entire ordeal, her hands trembling as she smoothed his blanket. The unspoken questions hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Finally, Silas turned from the fire, his face etched with a grim resolve. "He called the boy a Blackwood," he stated, his voice flat. It wasn't an accusation, but a request for the truth. Elara sank into the chair by the hearth, her strength failing her. She looked at this stoic man who had become her shield and knew she owed him her story. He had a right to know the enemy he was facing. "Alistair Blackwood is my son's grandfather," she began, her voice barely a whisper. Silas listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her face, his quiet attention an invitation to continue. She told him about Thomas, the judge's youngest son, a kind but weak man who had been terrified of his powerful father. She spoke of their secret courtship, of the promises Thomas had made to marry her and defy the judge. But before he could, a riding accident had taken his life, leaving her alone and pregnant. She described the judge's chilling reaction when she had gone to him for help, not for herself, but for her unborn child. He had offered her money to disappear, calling her a fortune hunter and her child a bastard who would never carry the Blackwood name. But when Rowan was born, perfect and healthy, the judge's tone had changed. He had started talking about bloodlines, about his legacy. He wanted the child, but not the mother. He wanted to erase her from the story. He would raise Rowan to be a man like him. She finished, her voice choked with a mixture of grief and fury. Cold and cruel and entitled. I could not let that happen. So I ran. When she was done, the cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire. Silas absorbed her story, a muscle working in his jaw. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice a low, firm anchor in her sea of fear. He came and knelt before her chair, taking her cold hands in his large, warm ones. His touch was steady, grounding. "My name," he said, looking her directly in the eye. "It's Blackwood, too." Elara stared at him, confused. "The judge is my father." The confession hung in the air, a shocking, impossible truth. He explained that he was the eldest son, the one who had walked away years ago after the war, unable to stomach his father's tyranny and cold ambition. He had left the name, the wealth, the entire world behind to build a life of quiet solitude on the mountain. He had never looked back. "He doesn't know I'm here," Silas said. "As far as he's concerned, his first son is long dead." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The shared name, the quiet strength, the inherent decency that was the very antithesis of the judge. This man was not just her protector. He was her son's kin. Two outcasts from the same cruel dynasty, brought together by fate in a remote mountain cabin. "He is your nephew," she whispered, her gaze dropping to where Rowan slept, safe and oblivious. "He is," Silas confirmed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He squeezed her hands. "And he is my responsibility. Both of you are." We will face this together. The final door between them had been opened. Their separate pasts, their individual fears, had merged into a shared cause. He was no longer just a kind stranger. He was family. Judge Blackwood did not wait long. He arrived 3 days later, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pines. He did not come alone. With him was the town marshal, a man whose loyalty was clearly to the judge's coin, and 2 grim-faced men who looked more like hired muscle than legal aids. They rode into the clearing, their horses trampling the quiet earth, a stark invasion of the peace Silas and Elara had fought to build. Silas met them on the porch. He was not armed, at least not visibly, but he stood with the rooted stillness of an ancient tree, a silent, immovable obstacle. Elara was right behind him, in the doorway of the cabin, Rowan held securely in her arms. She would not hide. This was her fight as much as it was his. "Silas," the judge said, his voice dripping with venomous surprise. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over his long-lost son with a flicker of shock before hardening into contempt. "So the prodigal returns, hiding on a mountain like a coward. And with this creature and her bastard." "He is not a bastard." Silas's voice was low and cold, a dangerous counterpoint to his father's heated anger. "And her name is Elara. She is my wife." The lie was seamless, spoken with such conviction that even Elara almost believed it. It was a shield, thrown up in the heat of battle. The marshal stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Judge Blackwood has a legal claim to his grandson. We have papers from the circuit judge, awarding him custody on the grounds of the mother being an unfit transient." He held out a piece of paper, a legal weapon meant to end the confrontation before it began. This was the moment. The climax would not be a clash of fists, but a battle of wills, of words, of fundamental rights. It was Elara who stepped forward, moving to stand beside Silas, not behind him. She met the judge's cold gaze, her own clear and burning with a mother's righteous fury. "Unfit?" she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. "Because I have no fortune? Because I chose to protect my son from a man who sees him not as a child to be loved, but as a legacy to be owned?" She turned to the marshal, her gaze unwavering. "This man," she said, her voice cutting, "offered me money to abandon my child. When I refused, he chose to steal him. That is not the act of a loving grandfather. That is the act of a predator." Then she did the one thing no one expected. She looked directly at Silas, her eyes full of a trust so absolute it was a vow in itself. "Silas Blackwood took us in when we had nothing. He has given my son shelter, warmth, and a quiet, gentle kindness your father wouldn't recognize. He has protected us. He has honored us." She reached out and took Silas's hand, lacing her fingers with his. Their joined hands were a symbol of their united front. "I have made my choice. We have made our choice. Our family will not be broken by your money or your hollow laws." Her speech, so plain and powerful, hung in the air. The judge was momentarily speechless, his face purple with rage. He had come expecting a terrified girl he could easily intimidate. He had not expected this proud, eloquent woman, nor the silent, implacable son he had long ago written off. Silas squeezed her hand, a silent signal of his unwavering support. He looked at his father, his eyes filled not with hate, but with a final, weary pity. "You have your answer," Silas said. "There is no child for you here. Now leave this land and do not return." The marshal, seeing the unbreakable will of the 2 people before him, and the lack of any real legal standing for a forced removal, shifted uncomfortably. This was not the easy task he'd been paid for. He looked at the judge, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his public defeat. There would be no violence. The battle had been won with truth and with the quiet strength of a chosen partnership. Defeated, the judge mounted his horse, cast one last look of pure hatred at the family he could not break, and rode away, his hired men trailing behind him like vultures, leaving a battle they had lost. The moment the riders disappeared into the trees, the rigid strength seemed to drain out of Elara. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her, and her knees felt weak. Silas's arm came around her instantly, his strength a solid, grounding presence. He led her back into the quiet of the cabin, the sudden peace almost deafening after the tense confrontation. Rowan, disturbed by the shouting, began to cry. The sound broke the spell of the aftermath, pulling them back to the immediate, tangible reality of their lives. This was what they had been fighting for. This small, wailing, precious life. "Here," Silas said, his voice gentle. "Let me take him." He held out his arms, and for the first time, Elara handed her son over to him without a flicker of hesitation. Silas held the baby with a surprising, innate tenderness, his large, calloused hand supporting Rowan's head as he cradled him against his broad chest. He began to walk the floor, his long, steady strides and the low, rumbling sound of his voice as he murmured nonsense to the infant, slowly quieting Rowan's cries. Elara sank into a chair, watching them. The sight of this stoic, solitary man so gently comforting her child unlocked something deep within her. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated love, so powerful it almost took her breath away. The grand battle was over, but this was the true victory. This quiet, domestic moment of aftercare. This was the peace they had won. While Silas soothed the baby, Elara noticed a small, dark stain on the sleeve of her dress. In her agitation, she had pricked her finger with her sewing needle earlier, and a single drop of blood had welled up and stained the cuff. It was a tiny injury, insignificant, but Silas noticed it as soon as he had settled Rowan back into his cradle. He came to her, his brow furrowed with a gentle concern. He took her hand in his, examining the small red mark. "You're hurt," he said softly. "It's nothing," she whispered, overwhelmed by his attention to such a small detail. He ignored her protest, fetching a clean cloth and a small bowl of water. He knelt before her and carefully, tenderly, washed the tiny pinprick and the bloodstain from her finger. His touch was reverent, his focus absolute. In that moment, he wasn't just washing a small wound. He was tending to the deeper hurts she had carried for so long. He was washing away the fear, the loneliness, the feeling of being utterly alone in her fight. When he was done, he looked up at her, his clear gray eyes holding hers. He didn't need to say a word. His actions spoke a language more profound than any promise. They spoke of devotion, of a partnership forged not just in defiance of a common enemy, but in the quiet, everyday acts of tending to one another's smallest wounds. This was the aftermath of their war. Not spoils and celebration, but a quiet, tender, and sacred act of care. With the threat of the judge finally gone, a new kind of quiet settled in the cabin. It was not the wary silence of their early days, nor the tense quiet of waiting for a battle. It was a deep, peaceful calm, the kind that comes only after a storm has passed and the air is washed clean. Their lives, which had been defined by survival, could now begin to be defined by choice. The bond between Silas and Rowan grew with each passing day. Silas, who had been so hesitant at first, now held the baby with a confident, easy tenderness. He would walk with him in the evenings, his deep voice a low rumble as he pointed out the stars or the shape of the moon. Elara would watch them from the cabin doorway, her heart swelling with a love that felt both new and ancient. She was witnessing the man she loved become a father to the son she adored. It was in these quiet, unguarded moments that their own intimacy deepened. One evening, Elara was humming a soft lullaby to a fussy Rowan. It was a song her own mother used to sing to her. Silas, who had been mending a leather strap by the fire, went still, his hands ceasing their work. He listened, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. When she finished and Rowan had finally drifted to sleep, he spoke, his voice unusually rough. That was beautiful. My mother taught it to me, she said softly. It's all I have left of her. He put down his work and came to sit beside her on the hearth. I remember my mother singing, he said, his voice distant. Before everything changed. Before my father's ambition soured everything it touched. It was a small, shared piece of their pasts, another thread woven into the tapestry of their connection. Later that week, Silas presented her with a gift. He had been working on it in his spare moments, and she had been consumed with a quiet curiosity. It was a box, carved from a single piece of rich, dark walnut. It was not ornate, but it was perfect. The lid fit seamlessly. The wood was sanded to a silken smoothness, and on the top he had carved a single delicate feather. For your things, he said, his voice gruff with a shy pride. So they have a safe place. She opened the lid. The inside smelled of fresh wood and care. She thought of the few precious things she owned, her mother's needle case, a pressed flower from Thomas, a spare ribbon. They were small, insignificant trifles to the rest of the world, but they were her history. He had built a beautiful, sturdy home for her memories. Tears welled in her eyes. Thank you, Silas. It was more than a box. It was a symbol. He was telling her that her past mattered, that her story was safe with him. It was a promise to not just protect her body, but to cherish her soul. She placed the box on the small shelf beside the cot, a new and permanent fixture in their shared home. It was a testament to the life they were building, one small, thoughtful, hand-carved gesture at a time. The first unguarded smile, the first shared memory, the symbolic gift, these were the quiet but momentous beats of a love story that was finally, truly, their own. The lie Silas had told his father, "She is my wife," lingered in the quiet air of the cabin. It had been a shield in a moment of crisis, a declaration made in the heat of battle. But now, in the calm that followed, it hung between them, shimmering with unspoken possibility. They were a family in every way that mattered. They shared a home, a name, a child. They had faced down the world together. Yet the final vow, the one made not for protection but for love, remained unsaid. One crisp morning, as Elara was hanging laundry on a line, Silas had strung between two pines. He came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watched her hands as she pinned a small shirt to the line. "Elara," he said at last, his voice serious. She turned to him, a question in her eyes. "What I said to my father. It doesn't have to be a lie." He took a breath, the words coming with a careful, deliberate weight. "I know this was an arrangement born of necessity. You have been safe here, and you will always be safe here. You are free to leave whenever you wish, to make a new life for yourself and for Rowan. You owe me nothing." He was giving her an out. He was, in his profound and unwavering honor, reminding her of her own agency. He was making it clear that his protection was not a cage. A wave of fierce, tender love washed over her. She looked at this man, at his steady gray eyes, at the home they had built in the wilderness, at the sleeping child, who was as much his in heart as he was hers in blood. Leaving was the last thing on earth she wanted. "And what if I don't want to leave?" she asked softly, her heart beating a steady rhythm against her ribs. "What if this is the life I want?" A slow, wondrous light dawned in his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Then I am asking you to stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not because you need a protector, but because I need you. I love you, Elara. I love you," she whispered back, the words as natural and necessary as breathing. It was not a grand proposal. There was no ring, no bended knee. It was a quiet conversation on a sun-drenched morning, a mutual confession and an invitation, a choice freely made to turn an arrangement of convenience into a partnership of the heart. Later that day, she found him by the creek, a thoughtful expression on his face. He was holding two smooth, flat river stones in his hand. "The old ways?" he said, looking at her. "On the mountain, a vow was sometimes sealed not with a ring, but with a stone. A promise of something solid, enduring." He held one out to her. It was gray and cool in her palm. "This is your home, Elara, Rowan's home, if you will have it." She closed her hand around the stone, its solid weight a comfort. "We will," she said. It was their true wedding, a quiet ceremony with the mountain as their witness, and the river stones as their rings. A simple promise, a quiet vow, and the beginning of a future they had chosen, together in the heart of the home they had built. The seasons turned, melting the last of the autumn chill into a mild, damp winter, then unfurling into the tender green of spring. Life in the cabin on Blackwood Mountain settled into a rhythm of profound, peaceful domesticity. The home that had once been a shell of solitude was now filled with life. The mornings were marked by the smell of Silas's coffee and Elara's baking, the afternoons by the sound of Rowan's happy gurgles as he played on a soft quilt by the fire. Their shared routines were no longer born of necessity, but were a celebration of their chosen family. Silas, the solitary mountain man, found a deep and abiding joy in fatherhood. He carved a whole family of small wooden animals for Rowan, his large hands moving with a now familiar, gentle precision. He would carry the boy on his shoulders as he did his chores, his deep voice a constant soothing presence in Rowan's world, naming the birds and the trees for him. Elara, the hunted survivor, had found her strength transformed. It was no longer the brittle strength of fear, but the deep, resilient strength of love. She planted a garden in the clearing, her hands in the rich earth, coaxing life from the soil. The cabin was filled with the scent of dried herbs and wildflowers. She taught Silas the lullaby her mother had sung to her, and the sound of his low, rumbling baritone humming the tune to a sleepy Rowan became the sound of her own heart's peace. They were a true partnership. He taught her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth. She taught him how to make the bread rise higher and the stew taste richer. Their skills, once honed for solitary survival, were now gifts they gave to each other, weaving their lives together into a single strong tapestry. Their love was a quiet, steady flame, tended in the small moments that made up their days. It was in the way he would touch the small of her back as he passed her in the narrow space of the cabin. It was in the way she set aside the warmest part of the bread for him. It was in the silent, shared glances over their son's sleeping head. One afternoon, Silas came in from the woods, his arms full of freshly cut pine logs. He stopped in the doorway, a look of quiet wonder on his face. Elara was sitting in the rocking chair he had made for her, singing softly to Rowan, the afternoon sun streaming through the window and illuminating her like a saint in a painting. The cabin was warm, clean, and filled with the scent of her baking. In that moment, he felt the full, staggering weight of his own happiness. This was home. It was not the logs or the roof. It was her. It was them. He set down the logs, the sound echoing the final, settling weight of his contentment. She looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and made his heart ache with the beauty of it. He crossed the room, knelt before her, and simply rested his forehead against hers, a micro-intimacy that spoke volumes. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, their shared life a warm, protective circle around them. As Rowan grew from an infant into a sturdy toddler, the single room of the cabin began to feel smaller. It was a happy problem, a sign of a life that was growing and thriving. One evening, after they had put Rowan to bed in his new, larger cot, Silas unrolled a piece of cured hide on the table. On it, he had sketched a rough but clear drawing in charcoal. It was their cabin, but with a new room added to the side, a window looking out toward the sunrise. "I was thinking," he said, his finger tracing the new lines. "He'll need his own space to sleep. And we could have ours." It was a practical plan, but it was also a profound declaration. He was not just planning a renovation. He was planning a future, a permanent home designed for a family that intended to stay, to grow. Elara looked at the drawing, a lump forming in her throat. She traced the lines of the new room with her own finger, her touch overlapping his. A room for their son. A room for them. A door that could be closed. The intimacy of the suggestion, the quiet promise of a private life together, was a new and breathtaking step. "Yes," she whispered. "It's perfect." The building of the new room became their shared project, a testament to their partnership. Silas felled the trees and hewed the logs, his strength and skill a marvel to watch. Elara helped him, learning to strip the bark and mix the chinking, her determination making up for her smaller size. They worked side by side, their movements a familiar, easy dance. Rowan played nearby in the grass, the sound of his laughter the music they worked to. On the day they hoisted the final roof beam into place, they stood back, hand in hand, and looked at their work. The new room was a seamless extension of the old, a physical manifestation of how their lives had grown together. It was more than just a structure of wood and mud. It was a home they had built with their own hands, a symbol of their enduring love. That night, for the first time in the new room, under a roof they had raised together, their love found its fullest expression. The last boundaries faded away, not in a storm of passion, but in a quiet, tender, and consensual coming together, a final affirmation of the vows they had made in their hearts. Later, lying in the darkness, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Elara felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost holy. He had been her shield, her protector. He had become her partner, her husband, the father of her child. He was her home. He stirred, his hand coming up to gently stroke her hair. "Elara," he murmured into the quiet, "you and the boy. You are my family. You are everything." It was the simplest of promises, a final plain speech vow whispered in the dark. It was the quiet, unassuming, and powerful truth upon which they had built their lives, and upon which they would build all their tomorrows.